Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hutchins. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits, and I'm so delighted that you were able to connect in from various parts of Maine to MANP Connects this morning. Before I welcome our guest, I just want to thank our sponsors for MANP Connects, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Northeast Bank, and Roundtable Technology. All of these are Maine companies that are doing an excellent job of supporting nonprofits and being good corporate citizens. So thanks to them. And if you get a chance to see someone who works there, let them know that you appreciate their company's support of nonprofits in Maine. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alan Ewing-Merrill, the Executive Director of the BTS Center, located here in Portland, to the stage, so to speak. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for this invitation, Jen. Great to be with you.
Yeah, Alan, you and I met several years ago, and I just immediately knew that you were an incredible new member, relatively new member to our community, and all the things that you and your family have done for the Portland area and Maine in general. I'm just so honored to have you here and excited to talk with you. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Let's just jump right in. Like, how did you end up becoming the executive director of the BTS Center here in Portland, Maine?
Well, I'm originally from Maine, so no offense to those of you who are born in other places, but I am a Mainer through and through. I grew up in a little town a couple hours up the coast called Searsport. Some of you may have driven through it on your way to Bar Harbor or something like that. So graduated from the University of Maine, go Black Bears. And actually was a high school English teacher for several years in a couple of Maine high schools, and then went off to Boston for graduate school at Boston University. I'm a United Methodist pastor, so I was ordained after graduating from BU, and I ended up spending about 10 years in Massachusetts. But in 2007, my wife and I moved back to Portland. Sarah is from South Dakota by way of Washington, D.C. So this is where we've raised our family. We have daughters at King Middle School and Deering High School in Portland. My wife Sarah is also a pastor. So I'm telling you sort of the long version of the story, but we came to Portland to redevelop what had been Chestnut Street Church, the big cathedral-like building next to Portland City Hall, in 2007. About 18 months after they sold that building, some of you may know that space as Grace, and was Grace Restaurant, now an event space. And so we co-pastored that church, which has roots back to 1795 here in Portland, and redeveloped it into a congregation called Hope Gateway, which is this really beautiful, radically inclusive, diverse, justice-seeking congregation. We did that for 12 years together, and Sarah still is pastor of Hope Gateway. Along the way, I co-founded a nonprofit called Hope Acts, which helps newly arriving asylum seekers. They have a housing project program on Sherman Street in Portland, across from the Y, English classes and lots of things like that. So I was the first executive director of that organization. And then just about 2 years ago, this position at the BTS Center opened up, and I so grateful to step into this new role, and I'm looking forward to talking with you a little bit about what the BTS Center is up to.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Alan. My next question is about, and I shared with you when we met in advance that I've been, as someone who is stewarding an organization that is for strengthening all 501c3 charitable nonprofits in Maine, and I'm personally speaking, I've always been a little unclear about faith-based organizations within that community.
Sure.
And sometimes I think it's because, particularly in New England, and you would be able to talk about this a lot better, which is why I asked you to talk to me, is where we tend to be a pretty secular society. That I sometimes I feel like faith-based organizations within the nonprofit sector are a little bit outside, treated a little bit outside. So I just wondered if you could help us set the stage for exactly when we talk about religious or faith-based organizations, within the nonprofit context, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, I think it is important to remember that every faith community is a 501c3 organization. And that's probably the best place to start, is just thinking about local congregations, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques. Each one of those is a nonprofit itself. There are something like 350,000 of those in the United States. There's no central registry of such things, but the last estimate I saw indicated there was something like 1,500 faith communities in Maine, and most of them are small. This is another topic, but since you alluded to it, Maine is the least religious state in the country in terms of religious identity and practice. So it's a really interesting landscape. And just to note that those faith communities will run the full spectrum from conservative on the right to progressive on the left. And I think sometimes faith communities get kind of lumped together, but it's really not true. There's just such a wide spectrum. Then, of course, there are like judicatory bodies. This would be like denominational offices, and each of those is a nonprofit as well. For example, like the Episcopal Diocese of Maine, which has 58 congregations in Maine, and they're working to connect them and strengthen them. And then I think about faith-rooted advocacy organizations. The one that I'm most familiar with, near and dear to my heart, is the Maine Council of Churches. So a statewide organization with 7 member denominations that work together, about maybe 500 or so congregations that are really working to build a culture of compassion, justice, and peace. So doing a lot of good work of advocacy in Augusta, addressing concerns like the opioid epidemic, environmental justice, human rights, racial justice, and training people of faith to do the good work of advocacy on the progressive side. And then just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, of course, there are large faith-rooted agencies, most notably Catholic Charities, and they're doing good work all over the state. And then a lot of, smaller faith-rooted nonprofits. The one that I mentioned, Hope Acts, that I helped to found. Another example that comes to mind, Greater Portland Family Promise, which my wife Sarah led for several years. So congregations working together to house or to care for families experiencing homelessness, taking turns being a family shelter and providing all the wraparound support while families are experiencing homelessness. Food pantries, clothing closets, soup kitchens, and in most of those cases, it is the volunteers and leaders' faith that compels them, but it's not about proselytizing. And I think that's a really important distinction, and sometimes I think secular nonprofit leaders miss that part. And what makes it complicated is that there are also some faith-rooted nonprofits that really do have a proselytizing component. So not all faith-rooted nonprofits are the same. And that's part of what I think makes it complicated.
Well, one of the things that when you and I were talking was really helpful, because I want to dig a little bit more into this. Like what are the roots of that hesitation, if you will, and you're getting at it right now, which is what is the ultimate impetus for the work that any particular faith-based organization is working on? And one of the things you and I talked about is this concept of the common good. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little more about that, about the distinction between if your mission is toward a broad definition of the common good versus trying to get across a really narrow agenda.
Right.
That's right? And then my understanding of faith-based organizations, and I worked in DC for a while on First Amendment issues, is that like many things in our society, a few people with really loud voices dominate the conversation, and then the assumption is that everybody else is right behind them.
Yeah, I think you've named that really well. And I have experienced, a bit of a tentative posture when working with secular nonprofits at times. And to some extent, I understand that. I think it is about this. You hear my bias in my response, but I think it is about this spectrum from conservative to progressive. And those that are on the more conservative, I think about evangelical Christian end, tend to have a real faith sharing, proselytizing dimension to their work. And I totally get that, particularly social service agencies have to maintain careful boundaries about that. And one of them is free access to services without fear that there's a religious agenda on the other side of it or something, no strings attached. What I know to be true, certainly here in Maine, is that the vast majority of faith-rooted nonprofits are not about that at all. It really is about the common good and shared values with the nonprofit leaders that you work most closely with. I think there are stereotypes about, what faith-rooted organizations are trying to do. But what I see is just incredibly passionate, loving, justice-seeking folks. People of faith help to win marriage equality in Maine. People have been absolutely on the front lines of welcoming immigrants. I mean, in very tangible ways. That I'm most familiar, of course, with faith communities in Portland, but providing security deposits, food, clothing, minutes on cell phones, mentoring, welcoming newly arriving asylum seekers into their homes. I mean, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars that Portland faith communities alone have contributed in terms of direct financial assistance and volunteer hours to help welcome asylum seekers in Portland. And truly, while the secular nonprofits are absolutely needed, I really believe that we wouldn't be where we are as a city if it weren't for the role of faith communities. So just really want to encourage nonprofit leaders to see religious organizations as partners, as a real asset. And of course, proceed cautiously if you run into that concern about proselytism, but work to develop trust and relationships. And I think what you'll find is just deeply rooted values of hospitality, justice, compassion, love, all the values that secular agencies hold as well.
This is a really specific question, but I'm curious because do you have a suggestion for if there's someone who's in a secular nonprofit and sees the potential for partnering with a faith-based organization, do you have a suggestion for how they might approach that partnership? Is there a question or two that, because sometimes I think we hesitate to partner because we're not even really sure if we're going to necessarily misstep or ask the wrong question. And especially when it comes to faith-based organization, I think there's a little bit of a shroud of mystery around, well, what are they actually after? And I just wondered, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but what have you seen work well in partnerships between secular and faith-based organizations about how you approach a successful partnership? Any words of wisdom there?
Yeah, I think start by building relationships. I think it always begins and ends with trust. Ask some questions, ask some questions about values. And I think it's okay to ask questions like, do you discriminate based on X, Y, or Z? If you're going to welcome a partnership, you want to make sure that those values are shared, right? So yeah, I think it has to work both ways too, right? Faith communities can also reach out and should be reaching out to nonprofit partners for the same reason, to establish trust. But I just think that there's a real opportunity there. I mean, what other nonprofit literally has their constituents showing up and sitting together in the same room week after week, reflecting on their deepest values? That's what faith communities do. I think that just doesn't exist in other places. Of course, the pandemic has made that more challenging, but I think there's possibility for real engagement. And I think many faith communities are eager to partner, and it would be good for them to partner more with secular nonprofits too.
Yeah, that's really, really, really good point. And more and more, especially with MANP's own journey around understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think we are really coming down to, it really comes to reasserting and reevaluating our values and what exactly, and not just paying lip service, really thinking through what are the values we want to hold up and support and invest in our communities. And so it's so interesting to see the direct connection between the EDI work that we're doing internally at MANP and thinking about how to share that usefully with our members, and this idea of faith-based organizations being the ones that are questioning their values on a weekly basis, and being really thoughtful about it.
At their best, at least, at their best.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I do remember going to church as a little kid, sitting in the pew going, what are we doing here?
Well, there's some of that as well, not gonna lie.
Yeah, just so everybody doesn't think we're grounded in the reality of it. But let's talk about the BTS Center, which has a remarkable history here in Maine. So tell us, what does BTS stand for, and how did it end up being where it is in its history?
Yeah, well, thank you. So my kids tell me that there is a very popular K-pop band called BTS. So they snicker at the name quite regularly. I have to remind them that this BTS goes way back, long before the members of that K-pop band were born or ever thought of.
I'm not sure we want to know what BTS stands for with the K-pop band.
We may not, but it's funny, the generational disconnect. I was at my office recently, and this group of adolescents walked by, and they saw BTS, and they immediately made the connection and started singing a BTS song, whatever. BTS is a nod to our predecessor organization, Bangor Theological Seminary, which, as you're right, has really long, deep roots back to 1814 in Bangor. So more than 200-year deep roots. And for 200 years, the seminary was really singularly focused on educating pastors for serving local churches in Maine and northern New England and beyond to some extent, but really focused on Maine and northern New England. So a faculty, a campus, a library, a student body, all the things that institutions of higher education have. And of course, the religious landscape has shifted, and the economics of higher education have shifted. And so for all kinds of reasons, a declining student body and challenging economics. In 2013, the Board of Trustees of the seminary made what was really an excruciating decision to suspend all of that, to basically suspend being an institution of higher education, to dismiss their faculty, to liquidate their library. I mean, they had sold their campus already in an effort to attain sustainability. So all of that, really
That's
painful
a big decision. Painful decision. No kidding.
Painful for the faculty, painful for the student body. I mean, it was, talk about disruption. But really, I think it was controversial, but I think there was a real sense that rather than spending down every last dollar in their endowment and then turning out the lights, that there might be something, better, more important to do. So they preserved a small endowment, small by higher education standards, and really began to think about new ways to explore theological education in ways that are relevant for the 21st century. So I joined the organization in July 2019, about 6 years into this experiment, or a time of exploration and experimentation. Today, we are a private operating foundation. There are different categories of foundations within IRS codes. We're not a grant-making foundation, but a foundation that distributes in the form of developing programs to fulfill our mission, which is to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. So 3 phrases in there that we reflect a lot on. Catalyze spiritual imagination. What does that mean? With enduring wisdom, really digging deep into our roots, for transformative faith leadership. So really focused on that. And we kind of have the energy of a startup. I sometimes call the BTS Center a 200-year-old startup. A new staff, a new programmatic focus, really engaged and creative board, entrepreneurial spirit. And today we're really focused our programmatic activity at the intersection of spiritual leadership and global climate devastation.
Wow, tell us about that. How did you come to that big topic? I mean, I can guess, but I'd love to hear it from you.
Well, this is a vision that I brought to the board very early in my time. It's not one that I stepped into the role with, but it's one that that sort of bubbled up for me early on. I'm in a doctoral program, so working on a professional doctorate, and it's a cohort that meets in Cambridge in the UK, or at least it did before the pandemic. But had a class with Dr. Larry Rasmussen, who's a really well-known Christian ethics scholar, especially around environmental ethics. And that class was just life-changing for me, transformational. I can't explain it except to say, sometimes I use this, sort of hyper-religious language and describe it as a kind of conversion experience, which is not language that comes commonly or comfortably even for me, but just had this experience of like, oh my gosh, like a light bulb moment, like this is it. Climate devastation is really the greatest existential threat that humanity has ever faced. And this is an all hands on deck moment where all the sectors need to come together. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren. So, those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are bearing the biggest burden for that in terms of, communities of color and indigenous communities and people in developing countries where literally their land is disappearing into the sea, or the crops that they've grown for generations are no longer viable. I just heard yesterday that 1 in 3 Americans has been personally affected by climate change this summer, which is not surprising if you think about it, with all the fires, the floods, the drought, extreme heat, weird, devastating storms. And of course, some of you may have heard that just last month, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body of the United Nations, released its 6th report kind of detailing exactly what's happening. And it's not good news. It's not good news. Climate devastation is undeniable, and it's the window of time that we have to address it is closing. So we're really thinking about the spiritual implications. There's a climate or environmentalist, Gus Speth, who talks about how he used to think that the top environmental problems were, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, climate change. And he thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those issues. But he now knows, we have 30 years of good science, that he was actually wrong. And he now says the top environmental problems are actually selfishness, greed, and apathy. Mm-hmm. And in order to deal with those, he says what we actually need is a cultural and spiritual transformation. And he ends this little quote by saying, and we scientists, we don't have a clue about cultural and spiritual transformation. So, I think that's such an important note, because cultural and spiritual transformation are not really within the purview of the science community, and they're not really within the purview of the public policy community either, even though we need all the best science and all the best public policy. I think those really are within the purview of the faith community. So we're trying to pay attention to that and think about, climate devastation as a symptom of something much deeper that's wrong with the way our society is hardwired. And if it's a spiritual sickness at the root, that the solutions have to have a spiritual component.
Well, I'll tell you, that's fascinating and so interesting to hear. Well, I have so many questions, but one thing I just want to say that's so resonating for me, Alan, is that essentially what you're saying is that, well, I told you that I personally am in terms of what I'm interested in working on is potentially thinking about new paradigms for the nonprofit sector, and not simply accepting that we need to work within the way it is, but that we need to really think through the history of where the nonprofit sector came from. Again, it comes back to these values questions. Right. And one of the things that we've always struggled with in the nonprofit sector is sort of that drive to scientific approach. Like, right. You need to quantify the problem, and then you come up with a very linear way to address the problem, and then you fix it and you move on. And what gives me actually quite a bit of hope in what you're sharing is that scientists are beginning to realize that that's not enough. It's right. not enough to look at the numbers and say efficiency and innovation are going to get us to the end of the day. We right. actually have to turn deep inside ourselves, which is where I think the nonprofit, or the majority of the nonprofit sector is because we already talked about this inspiration that people get to actually show up and do the hard work of taking care of their neighbors. It doesn't come from reading a scientific report. That's not the motivation. The motivation comes internally. And yet, as a society, we've never done a good job of understanding how to invest and prioritize in that deep inner space. And
Right.
so I'm just so excited that you, as a leader, and your organization has the courage to do this work, because it's going to be hard to get people to understand what you're trying to do, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think what you're noting is the impact, honestly, of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, right? And we approach all things like they're machines with inputs and outputs, and that's it. And I think we're coming to a place where we realize it's more than that. So I mentioned selfishness, greed, and apathy, but it gets manifested in this sort of pernicious cycle of domination, extraction, and consumption, right? And I think those influence even the nonprofit sector, I think, sort of this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Those are the rules that we're taught we have to live by, right? Like,
right.
Act like a business,
right.
And so many of us have adopted that mentality and that framework appropriately in some cases, but we know there's something about our work that's not being, the arts is a perfect example of that, where it's
right.
like, so many times the nonprofit arts groups gets lumped into this idea of entertainment. And there's these more spiritual, communal values that we still as a society haven't figured out how to name and hold up and value. And again, I get to this idea of invest in.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I think we've never needed the arts more than we need them right now. I really believe that.
No kidding.
One of the things I'm really excited about is a project of applied research that we're just beginning. And this is a cross-sector cohort of leaders that we're forming, leaders of nonprofits from around Northern New England, to explore the question that you're getting at right here. How would organizations act differently today if they embodied an ecological imagination? So we're going to be studying that over about 18 months. Like, it's a co-learning community. It's not like the BTS Center has the answers to that question. We want to know the answer. We want to explore that question with others across sectors. So not just faith partners, in fact, mostly not faith partners, although we're interested in applying it to the practice of faith. But really thinking together, rather than thinking of organizations as machines, like you said, thinking of them as taking our cues from ecology, from the environment, from the natural world. Yeah.
I just want to share with you, because I'm so hungry for finding the people that are asking these questions. And I have to say, I was really heartened the other day because a friend shared an article, and it was from the Financial Times, which I think is based in London. But they had a tagline, and I'm not gonna get it right, but I loved it when they said, "We're capitalists, but we think there's a better way." Like, that was their tagline. Like, because that's what I grapple with, Alan, is like, I'm very much I've learned this about myself, that I'm not going to be the disruptor who marches in the streets. Like, it's just it's not. I'm not going to be the person who starts the revolution. I'm much more in line with trying to work within the system and see what things I can do within the system. And so it's so interesting to me to find people. And I feel like you guys are in this space of trying to understand, how do we work with what we've got? We need both, right? We need the disruptors.
We need all kinds of change agents.
We need all kinds of change agents. Exactly. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I want to ask you a very particular, specific question, because I think that there are probably, I'm hoping that there are people on this call who are inspired by this as much as I am. What kind of challenges did you come against with your vision and getting that across to your board? Or maybe it sailed right through, but
nothing sails right through, does it, Jen?
Nothing worth sailing sails right through.
Well, it's interesting. I brought this to the board at our very first board meeting together.
Wow, how bold.
I'd been in the job just 2 months. I'd spent 2 weeks in Cambridge, as I mentioned, during that time. And of course, I'd met with every board member individually and listened to a lot of other people. I've been kind of on a listening tour. But really, trying to keep a real open heart and mind about what we might do, because as I said, it had been a time of experimentation, but there wasn't a cohesive sort of sense of what we were about yet, which is normal because it was an organization in deep change. But our board chair, Helen Scalia, who happens to be on this call today, I think.
Helen.
Hi, Helen. Said, Alan, I want to give you an hour on this board agenda just to talk about what you've been hearing, what's been bubbling up for you. Just talk with us about where. So brand new executive director, first meeting together, and I thought, what the heck? I'm just going to drop this on the table, So I did, with a little fear and trembling. Of course, I worked really hard to prepare a presentation with my early thoughts about how this might function. I didn't know where we would be, and of course, the reaction ran the gamut from, we had 9 members of the board at the time, ran the gamut from, oh my gosh, this is amazing. When can we start? That was on one end. And then, on the other end, I don't know, like, is climate really a thing that people care about, especially faith leaders? Do they care about that? And so there was a process. We had a board retreat soon afterward where we brought in a thought partner, an environmental studies professor from Colby, to help us think that through. And basically the board gave me a green light to experiment with it, to try some things, to see what happens. Not to, put out our shingle just yet, or, redesign our website around this vision, of course, but to try some things. And it has been really an incredible journey. And I think what we're finding is, yes, this is something that people care about more and more and more, especially as we're learning exactly what's happening to our planet and the ways in which we're complicit. I am just excited about turning the attention of faith leaders all over the world to this attention, because we need a movement. And as I think Bill McKibben says, we don't have time to build a new movement. We have to retrofit one that already exists. There's, I think Bill McKibben also says, this is the moment for which the church was created, which I think is powerful. And this is not a new idea. There's in 1967, before you and I were born, I think, more than 50 years ago. Maybe you were. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
I was born in 1970.
Good call, Alan. Good call.
Okay. Good call. Anyway, in 1967, this scientist, Lynn Townsend, said, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. That was more than 50 years ago.
Wow.
So, yeah. So incredible. People were imagining this way back then. But anyway, it's been a process of experimentation, and I'm so grateful for a board that was willing to trust a brand new executive director to flex, to stay open and to see what happened.
Yeah. Well, my takeaway from that to highlight for others is, you were prepared when you went in there. You took a risk. You acknowledged that it was a risk.
Absolutely.
I'm going to guess that you had a pretty good sense of a good amount of trust among yourself and the individual board members at this point.
I had great conversations with each one of them. That's all I can say.
Yeah. So I just want to, really key there that risk, also being willing to take risk, also knows that you can trust the ground on which you're standing. And so I just want to highlight that if there's an ED out there with a really bold idea, I wouldn't want to push you to go be risky without giving you the counsel of taking the time to build that relationship and trust with each individual board member ahead of time.
Absolutely.
So that you feel just like a diving board, if you will, you feel like there's something behind you that's going to give you that spring action, and that you're not starting, you're not trying to jump off a cloud.
I think that's really important.
Yeah. So I just wanted to highlight that. I know I want to make sure that we leave time for other things, but I'm imagining, and there's been some great points in the chat, and which I'm really grateful for. Thank you all for getting into this. People are talking about how colonization has been such a negative, it has had such a negative impact on our communities. And Our
Yes,
friend Maria is pointing out that there's so much wisdom in indigenous knowledge and prophecies, and
absolutely.
that's another example of a group that has so much wisdom in how they center their values. That is,
Yeah, can I talk about that for just a second? Because
please do. Yeah.
I think that's such a good point. Recently, I was introduced to a new phrase, and that is atmospheric colonization. This idea coming from developing country leaders about how white Westerners have colonized the atmosphere, literally the atmospheric vapors we have colonized. So I think the work of decolonization is so important. The BTS Center in a former iteration prior to my time funded a project called Decolonizing Faith, thinking about the ways in which decolonization must be part of our work. And we were so grateful to have Sherry Mitchell as a keynote speaker at our convocation last year.
She's so inspiring.
She's incredible, the wisdom that she brings. We absolutely need that wisdom. This year, our convocation, one of our convocation coming up the end of this month, one of our conversationalists will be Caitlin Curtis, who's also a Native leader, who's written a book actually called Native. She's a Christian Native leader. So I wholeheartedly agree, and I think it's beholden on all of us to really attend to decolonizing work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Quickly, if I imagine there are people on the call who are curious as to how they can stay engaged in some of these conversations. There have been some suggestions in the chat, but how would you recommend if people were interested in learning more about what you're doing at BTS Center? Is there an invitation you can offer to them about events or other things?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned our convocation coming up the end of this month. This is a legacy program of the seminary with roots dating back to 1905. So held every year since 1905, except for 2 years, 1918 and 1919, which you can probably guess why. During the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, they didn't have a convocation, but every other year. And last year we pivoted and moved it online, which we're doing again this year. But it's a 2-day gathering with a keynote speaker, Reverend Mariama White Hammond, who's an African-American pastor and leader in the city of Boston. She's actually works for the city of Boston around sustainability, and really inspiring person. And then 4 conversationalists. You can find all of this on our website at convocation2021.org or on our website, thebtscenter.org. So that's coming up, and it's going to be a really, really fantastic online event with online components, but also guided offline components. We know nobody can stay on Zoom for 8 hours. So being really intentional about logging on, logging off, and doing meaningful things even while offline, and music and arts and contemplative practice and all kinds of things like that. And then this fall, not on our website yet, but we're really looking forward to it. We're planning for a kind of multifaceted series focused on the topic of eco-grief. Really attending to I think what is a really important practice of acknowledging the losses that we're facing. So there'll be public conversations, there'll be a book study group and a prayer huddle, and like lots of different components, talking with theologians and public ritual, sort of reclaiming the practice of lament. And we're working with a diverse music collective called The Many to put together these public rituals that will be available online. Just really looking forward to this series. So that we'll be launching that real soon. Starts in October.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to ask you what seems like a really obvious question, but I think it's important. Are people who do not ascribe to a specific faith invited? Absolutely,
yes. Our roots are Christian, sort of in the mainline progressive Christian tradition, but we have people from all different faith traditions that plug in, and people of no particular tradition at all. Spiritual but not religious, sort of the nuns, NONES. Absolutely. I think, we're asking big spiritual questions that I think apply and are relevant to people regardless of how you think about yourself in terms of religious identity. And when I say faith leader, I always mean that very broadly construed, not just people who are ordained clergy by any means, but all different kinds of spiritual leadership.
That's great. Thank you for that. Well, we are coming towards the end of our time together, and I always end with, if there's some kind of first of all, I want to give you an opportunity to just say, are there any other points that you were excited to make today that you'd like to make? And then if you would share with us anything you've been reading or listening to lately that you'd like to suggest to people, or things that you found inspiring, or actually maybe in these times, as you point out, there's a lot of fear and anxiety. I was going to point out the whole that system of extraction and consumption, and then there also leads to those feelings of anger and fear, right? And that
Totally.
need to heal. But so maybe there's been something you've read or listened to lately that's been particularly soothing. And the word that I try to use these days is, how can we give each other more ease in our lives? So anyway, any last thoughts, and a book or something you've listened to recently that you've found helpful?
Sure. I think you're right to name that. I think there's so much anxiety and grief and fear floating around, and those are hard emotions that we can't control very much. So what I see happening is that people move to anger, because anger we can control. Anger is actually a secondary emotion that usually is masking something else. So all the stuff that we're seeing around, like anti-vaccinations and anti-mask and all that, I think is this anger that's projected at school boards and blah, blah, blah. I think so much of it is fear, anxiety, grief, loss, that's manifesting itself that way. So I have some real thoughts about, how important it is to attend to our spirits in this moment, and to have practices that renew our spirits, and it starts, I think, with gratitude, thinking about the things for which we're grateful, and there always is something. In terms of what's inspired me lately, one Saturday evening in July, Sarah and I attended a concert of the Portland Symphony Orchestra. So there's a Maine nonprofit gem. The music of John Williams at the Seaside Pavilion in Old Orchard Beach. We kind of
went to that concert?
Kind of on a whim, and it was so amazing. The scores of Star Wars and Jaws and E.T. and Schindler's List. It was magical. So I wanted to mention that as just a really special.
Thank you.
I also want to commend this book, which I kind of I haven't mentioned actually. All We Can Save. This is written by 60 women at the forefront of the climate movement, and we had an event with the leaders of this last night. So that recording will be up on our website soon. Great, great, great book, great collection. And then this book, which actually our board is reading together, starting today, The Story of More, How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here. Really accessible, powerful read. So there's two book recommendations.
I knew you'd come prepared with more than one option. I really appreciate it. Alan, this has been really, really great. I enjoyed it. I knew it would be, and it surpassed my expectations. So thank you so much. Good luck with that board meeting later today.
Thanks so much. I look forward to it. And thanks for the invitation, Jen. Great to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks. So everybody, thanks again to our sponsors, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Northeast Bank, and Roundtable Technology. Really appreciate you guys as community partners. And hey, the last one in this series, in 2 weeks, we're going to have Shima Kabir-Igi of Maine Initiative. She's coming on in 2 weeks to meet with me. So hope to see you all then. Thanks again. Have a great Friday and have a good weekend. Take care, everyone.